DiscerningHearts.com presents Regnum Novum, bringing forth the new evangelization through Catholic social teaching, with Omar Gutierrez. Omar Gutierrez is the special assistant to the Archbishop of Omaha, as well as the manager of the Office of Missions and Justice. He's had numerous articles published in various Catholic publications and is a highly sought-after speaker on various aspects of Catholic social teaching. He is also the author of The Urging of Christ's Love, the Saints and the Social Teaching of the Catholic Church. Regnum Novum, bringing forth the new evangelization through Catholic social teaching, with Omar Gutierrez. I'm your host, Chris McGregor. Talk to us about the principle of subsidiarity.
Principle of subsidiarity fits within the larger picture because it comes as a kind of damper, if you will, to universal destination of goods. And as the middle of the five principles, it's really the core principle, I think, of all the other ones. The fact that it's ignored so much in most of the social justice teaching is really pretty unfortunate. But you have the common good, which we discussed. It's the sum total of social conditions that allow for people to reach their human fulfillment more easily and more fully. And for the Catholic, that's going to be sanctity. Okay, so the sum total of social conditions that allow us to be saints more easily and more fully. And then the second one, universal destination of goods, is the idea that the things of this world, which God has given us, are meant for everybody and not just a few. And that part of our job as Catholics and Christians, that all the goods of this earth which God has given us have been given for everybody and not just a few. And then part of our obligation as Catholics is to make sure that if we've been gifted by God with wealth or with means, to share those with as many people as possible. In other words, the point of having stuff is not to have stuff, but to make sure that that stuff is distributed well. Now, at this point, then, we start to get those questions about, okay, you've used the phrase distribution of wealth. What do you mean? Isn't that socialism? Isn't that some, statist approach to economics, etc.? Mm-hmm. Well, no. The church has been very clear that socialism is not the way to go. So then when the church says distribution of wealth, what does it mean? And who's in charge of it? Well, we are. We, the people, the citizens, the average person on the street, the person with wealth, they're responsible primarily with that distribution. And subsidiarity is the principle that is brought in at this point, therefore, to express that idea. Subsidiarity is the notion that whatever issue it is in the social issue, that social issue ought to be addressed at the lowest possible order, or as close to that issue as possible. So give me an example. If you have homelessness, right, it's best that the people of that community deal with the homeless person in their community, rather than having, just for example, say the federal government coming in and trying to make blanket policy for how to deal with the homeless, because each situation is different, each community is different, the amount of resources the communities are different, so it's better for the local authority to handle it better than some distant authority or higher order authority. This is precisely what Pius XI says in Quadragesimo Anno, on the 40th anniversary of Regnum Novum, in paragraph 23. He says this: just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice, and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order, to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. For every social activity ought of its very nature to furnish help to the members of the body social, and never destroy and absorb them. Mm-hmm. And what he says basically is, just as it's wrong for somebody to come in and take your property without your wanting them to, it's wrong for somebody to come in and take from you your responsibility. Your rights and responsibilities belong to you and go hand in hand. If they take away your responsibility, then it's not a far further step for them to take away your rights.
You mentioned order. Ideally, that's a grouping of individuals, not just one individual.
Right.
So the most common order would be the family.
Precisely right. That family, which is that fundamental cell of society, is that basic association which is to help society. So again, in the case of, let's say, the homeless person, where's this man's family? Go there first. See if they might not know where he is. They may want to know where he is. They may love the opportunity to be able to help that man and get him into their family again and care for them. So go to the family first. Laws and policies that help keep families together and help empower families to help themselves are the best policies to go. After the family, then you go to other orders. But here's the other interesting thing about the social teaching is that it doesn't assume necessarily that when they talk about orders of authority that they mean necessarily government. It can also be other associations, not just the family, but also the parish. The parish can be an order, an association which can take charge of a community, a parish, a geographical boundary, right, over which they have some authority, over which they have some interest. And so you can go to the parish in this local area where the homeless man finds shelter and say, well, what can the parish do for this individual? And not just the parish. You also have Rotary clubs or Lions clubs, women's associations, all sorts of different groups and associations, shelters, all of them which can be run privately by churches or by private associations, which can help serve the society, help serve that community. Those are the people we should be going to first. And the other thing that subsidiarity encourages is this notion of cooperation. We started our whole discussions on social justice, of course, with Christ, Jesus as being the number one thing we ought to be shooting for, the one person that we ought to be shooting for, and the person that motivates our action. And the second point we made was communion versus opposition. We have this tendency to think of the local government and the federal government as being in opposition. And to a certain degree, that's true. And certainly the founding fathers of the United States wanted it to be clear that there was a separation between federal powers and state powers, as well as city powers and county powers, etc. But subsidiarity presumes or encourages us to understand that the higher orders of authority, the federal government or the state government, will help in cooperation with families, with local associations, with city officials, will in cooperation with them help them solve the social issues they find most important.
At its very, very heart, the seeds of this are found in the gospel. They are found in the scripture, whether it's the teachings of St. Paul, and when he speaks about the union that occurs within the authority even of that central unit, the family, or even of the modeling of the Holy Family, right, and how they engaged in living with each other as demonstrated in the Gospels.
Yeah, the ancient view of the relationship of the individual within society was based on, first their relationship with family, with kin, with clan or tribe, and then that relationship with the rest of the social community. And this is precisely why in Middle East and in ancient times, and unfortunately we've lost a lot of it today, is that great emphasis on hospitality. That when somebody comes to your door, that you open your home to them, you feed them, you take care of them, precisely because it could be you next. We have that responsibility as individuals or as groups, as families, to help those who are in need, who come to us. And as time has gone on, it wasn't until really the Enlightenment when you had a figure like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his Social Contract who started to say that in order for humanity to get past our own foibles and problems, we had to create well-ordered societies, state structures that would help run the society. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is writing in the late 18th century, less than 50, 60 years later, you have Karl Marx who's saying that state must run everything. That state has to run all aspects of society. Marx believed his plan would solve human sin, would solve human alienation, but that's why his approach is so incompatible with Christianity. The responsibility cannot lie primarily with the state, because the state is a construct that ought to exist to help the lower order, help make us able to reach sanctity. Sanctity has to be a personal relationship, a personal quest, and not some organized institutional reality.
You have to give the person the opportunity to exercise their free will.
Yes, exactly.
In essence. I'm recalling the story that our Lord Jesus spoke of in the Gospels of the man who was sleeping, and the banging on the door came, and someone wanted bread.
Yes.
And that it was a given. Yes, absolutely, he must get up and respond. It was just an assumed type of thing that you do help your neighbor. And also, you see in the scriptures, which is the basis for Catholic social teaching,
Yes.
that response of community responding to the needs of those who are calling out for assistance.
Yeah, exactly. This is why when we talked about look, judge, act from John the 23rd, where are you looking? You look first within your family, and then at the person across the street, and down the street in the neighborhood and on that block, whatever. You look at those persons who are right in front of you. This is the thing that the social teaching wants us to understand, and I think this is where, as you're saying, it sort of ties in with the Gospels. Christ's great commandment to us is to love as he loved us. And he didn't love us corporately. One of the wonderful things about, when you think about the multiplication of loaves, right? When Christ saw that the people were hungry, he was moved, right, to try to feed them, and he did. And what's the wonderful phrase in the scriptures is they all had their fill, and there was only enough left over exactly for the 12 bushel baskets, which has its own, imagery. But everybody was fed to the point exactly where they needed to be fed. It wasn't some blanket feeding of a mass of people. Christ saw the individual needs of each person. And likewise, we are called to have to try to meet that need, which is why blanket policies that come from a distant authority cannot possibly meet the needs of the individual where they're at, because they don't take into account the individual. And there are practical ramifications of all this as well. And John Paul II actually points them out in his great encyclical Centesimus Annus on the 100th anniversary of Regnum Novum. And this is what he says. He says, by intervening directly and depriving society of its responsibility, the social assistance state leads to a loss of human energies and an inordinate increase of public agencies, which are dominated more by bureaucratic ways of thinking than by concern for serving their clients, and which are accompanied by an enormous increase in spending. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is John Paul II in a Social Doctrine encyclical saying, when there's this huge insistence on the state, the social assistance state, taking over what the individuals and local authorities ought to be doing, what happens is you have bureaucracies that are more concerned with efficiency than they are with the needs of the clients, the individual. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you have an increase in spending and probably wastefulness as well. And this also goes to, by the way, the question of the responsibility of the state and the responsibility of the citizen. Franz Jagersdottir, who was an Austrian during World War II, was presented when the Nazi Germany wanted to annex Austria. His town and all of Austria was presented with voting for or against this. Franz Jagersdottir was the only man in his village who voted against it. And one of the reasons he gave was the state, the National Socialism Nazi state, wants to take over social assistance. They want to take over the responsibility of families and local communities. And he said, that is fundamentally wrong. It's our responsibility to do so. So not only did he not vote for it and was very vocal against it, but Franz Jagersdottir went out of the way to start of soup kitchens and local assistance so that they could start serving the people there in his village instead of giving it over to the Nazis. So Franz's point is simply that subsidiarity is something that ought to be held fast to. And as people have complained in the past about the writings of Paul VI or John Paul II even, and the teaching of the social teaching of the Church, one of the complaints is that the Church is requesting international, in certain cases, authorities for international labor and other things. And Pope Benedict XVI talks about this in Caritas in Veritate, how he says there should be an international authority to make sure that labor laws are being followed well from country to country. And some people were shocked that he should say such a thing. I mean, isn't that the definition of a kind of statist approach. But in that next sentence, Pope Benedict XVI says, as all the popes have said, but the principle of subsidiarity must always be respected and held sacrosanct.
Let's talk about the other extreme of this,
Yeah.
that the church, it seems to me, gets crushed in between these great bigs. One is the big government, and the other, of course, is the big business.
Yes.
So often is given to Chesterton as the one who was able to articulate it, but he was basically pulling from Leo XIII, wasn't he, about the concerns of the two dynamics of the bigs.
And Leo XIII and Pius XI, and by the way, Pius XII says this explicitly in his radio messages, that just as big government is a bad idea for the reasons that John Paul II says, and there's waste and bureaucracy and the rest of it, big business is a bad idea too. Big business cannot provide for the local community in the same way that a local business can, precisely because big business or the businesses are making blanket policy decisions that cover the entire company that may not, in point of fact, take into account the needs and the wants of the local community. So you take something like Walmart, and I don't have any great beef against Walmart necessarily, but there's a perfect example of a business which has brought into certain communities goods which that community simply doesn't need, has never needed, and will never need. But because of Walmart's business plan, they've been able to bring in very cheap and a wide variety of goods that people now, because it's available to them, have convinced themselves they need, because they see it on TV or they see it in the next town or whatever. They spend their money, they spend their goods, they're convinced of these things that they know they never needed, and so they're wasting money on things that they could be using to help the homeless guy on the street. That sense of that local community, that local business that knows their customers well, that knows the needs of their customers, that can get what they want here, that can get what the community really desires, that's better for the community than a big business somewhere else making determinations for what that community wants and desires.
At the heart of it, it's relationship.
Exactly.
And that's a reflection of the Trinity.
And that's a reflection of the Trinity and a reflection of what we've been talking about. The number one point is relationship with Christ Jesus. It's about relationship. And if you don't have that, now that's not to say that, the local manager of the Walmart can't have a relationship with the people there, and if they want a certain good, he can go get it from some other store or order it, and that certainly happens. But there's a whole host of goods and products that Walmart provides that are not needed, or one can point this out, that this proliferation of Chinese goods, for instance, that come from a nation that is as everybody knows, is using slave labor, child labor, is subjugating its people, one-child policy, oppressing the women and the children. There is less freedom there, etc., etc. They're able to produce goods at a cheaper rate, and we are, in a sense, forced to buy them from places like Walmart because they're making blanket decisions that the local community can't input on.
There's the concern because now we want to have the lower price. We want to have the lower, we want to be able to get those goods. And so we go to those who will provide that at the lower price. It may come from, say, China.
Right.
But in essence, we're encouraged to spend because we're feeding the bigger machine that keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you end up having an economy that ends up growing so big
Yes.
that the weight of a potential collapse crushes the citizenry
Yes.
that's been trying to feed it continually.
Exactly, and this is precisely why, Chris, questions of economics are really so important, because you have economic theories. People's eyes roll in the back of their heads when they hear economics, as they think figures and graphs and everything, and that is partly the fault of bad economics, to make it a sort of mathematical game. But really, economics, as Chesterton will say and others, economics is simply the study of human action within the field of limited or scarce goods. That's all it is. It's a branch of philosophy. And what you think about the human person and what you think the human person needs is going to color the way you approach economics. And so you had Karl Marx, who approached economics in a very significant way, but you have other economies, short of socialism or short of Marxism, that really believe that the point of human existence is consumption, is buying stuff.
On another aspect of this, especially in the heartland of America, which this program is emanating from,
Yes.
we have the question of how big is big farming,
Oh, yes.
of companies coming in and who are trying, they would say, to be able to provide food and goods in the most efficient, economical way to the citizenry,
Right.
buying up land and mass producing and taking away the ability of the smaller farmer
Yeah.
to be able to continue on with a legacy that's been passed down to him from generation to generation, and being able to produce goods that he feels serves his local populace.
Exactly right. This is I'm glad you brought it up. This is a very important issue because the argument from the other side is going to say, well, look, you can talk all you want about what's nice and what's good and what the people need, but the fact of the matter is that cheap eggs saves people's lives, cheap chicken, cheap beef saves people's lives. That's what's most important. And so, and the fact that we're providing it with these huge farms is okay. The answer to that is the age-old question: does the end justify the means? What means are you using to provide the cheap eggs, cheap chicken, and beef, etc.? There was a film I watched which was about the food industry. I'm not going to mention the name of the film, and the treatment of animals is not really something that motivates me or gives me very emotional. They're animals; they're not human people. But what really disturbed me was the way the farmers were treated by the corporate farming machine. You have individuals, say chicken farmers, for instance, who are forced to buy very expensive equipment in order to house as many chickens as possible in a small space. They have to block out the sun so the chickens don't know what time of day it is. They have to have a very expensive air circulation system. As a result, they have to have a certain kind of bedding on the floor of the chicken house so that the diseases don't spread. They have to have a very expensive system of delivering food. All these expenses are built up, and all those are taken on by the farmer, so that the farmer is millions of dollars in debt in order to be able to have this contract of raising chickens for the larger company. A contract which that company can end after any violation whatsoever, leaving the farmer in debt they will never, ever be able to get out from under. That's unjust. There's just no two ways about it. It's simply unjust. That's akin to slave labor. There's nothing just about that. And in the name of getting cheaper chicken, we're allowing that to happen. There's no reason for that. Or there's a case of a gigantic meat processing plant on the East Coast, where knowing full well that they cannot allow a union to come in because it would raise costs for them, they bus workers from about a 100-mile radius around the meat plant. Meanwhile, the local community, the town in which the meat plant exists, is destitute and barren because there's no jobs. And the reason there are no jobs is because those people tried to unionize, and the meat packing plant said, well, we're not going to let you, and so we're going to find work elsewhere. We're going to find laborers elsewhere. And amongst some of the laborers they find are those from other countries. They advertise for laborers in Mexico and in other Central American countries, and those workers come up, promise of work, and they're paid less, they're not giving benefits, and then, in order to appease the federal government, that company therefore hands over some illegal immigrants to the federal company, when it's their own fault for those people coming in the first place. In order to appease the federal government. I mean, this is all of this in the name of getting us cheap pork, cheap chicken, cheap beef. It would be much better for us to control our desires for beef than to allow injustices like that to continue.
Some may say that's a prime example of big business gone bad.
Yes.
What's happened in the Central American countries is an example of how big government goes bad. And i.e. that person comes to America because in his local community, the situation is such where it is so deprived because of the oppression of a government, and they are living in a poverty that they're seeking to come up. And big government, i.e. the United States, giving the big government Central American country funds, it does not trickle down to that impoverished farmer who is seeking some way to feed and care for his family. Some would say that the principle of subsidiarity would have you, instead of giving the money to the government, giving it to that farmer, giving it to that small community, so that it, in a micro way, can build up like a plant.
No, you're exactly right, and we've been talking about the sins of big business and big government, but let's also be clear. I mean, this is why this whole point of opposition and communion. I'm not trying to pit one person against another or one thing over another. The great, wonderful thing about being Catholic is you have this sort of both and approach to things. The Church understands that a free market system is a better system. In fact, John Paul II says this. Benedict XVI assumes a free market system in Caritas in Veritate. Now, it depends on what you mean by free market, obviously, and people have their different definitions. But in the case of, say, giving aid to third world countries, which Paul VI said we ought to do in Populorum Progressio from 1967, when we give aid to countries, the question is who we're giving aid to. Are we giving aid to their federal governments, right, which then make policy decisions that don't meet the needs? Or do we give them aid to allow them to start setting up free market systems so that they too can start benefiting in the global trade and free trade with other local neighboring countries, etc.? There have been a number of books written on this, and the principles of colonialism, for instance, Pope Paul VI says in Populorum Progressio that while certainly there are certain sins of colonialism, the oppression of people and racist attitudes, the fact is that colonialism has been able to bring principles of the free market, rule of law, constitutional government, the rights of the individual person, the dignity of the human person, to countries, to areas where those ideas had been foreign. So you look at a place like India, for instance, which has the fastest growing economy right now, maybe just after China, is exporting their intelligence to the United States and to Great Britain and to other places. And all of it a result, as the Prime Minister of India said recently, as a result of this exportation of ideals and ideas and that dignity of the human person, which had been foreign to some of the ideology that was there before.
Thank you, Omar.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
You've been listening to Regnum Novum, bringing forth the new evangelization through Catholic social teaching with Omar Gutierrez. To hear and or to download this episode, along with many others, go to discerninghearts.com. There too you can obtain a copy of Omar Gutierrez's book, The Urging of Christ's Love, the Saints, and the Social Teaching of the Catholic Church. Or you can find it at any fine Catholic bookstore. This has been a production of discerninghearts.com. I'm your host, Chris McGregor. Join us next time for Regnum Novum, bringing forth the new evangelization through Catholic social teaching with Omar Gutierrez.